Hello, this is Catherine O'Connell and welcome to part 1 of this lecture on prosocial behaviour. From a social psychological perspective, which has been our emphasis in Level H, we've been exploring the ways our behaviour, judgments and attributions are shaped by the social context, including the groups we belong to. For the past 2 topics, we've been focusing on the impact of social context upon antisocial forms of behaviour, in aggression and prejudice, for example. In this topic, we give our consideration to the ways that we can apply this understanding to facilitate prosocial orientations, which can be applied in both formal and informal educational contexts, as you will see in the alternative exam assessment question on this topic. In the first, rather dramatic quote on this slide, we see prosocial behaviour being defined in terms that reflect our capacity to move beyond basic norms of decency and politeness and to engage in activities that seem to be directly in the service of others, in which our own needs are subordinate. As we shall see in this first lecture on the topic, some of the classic psychological accounts tend to focus on the inherent capacities of some individuals towards prosocial dispositions and seem to equate this with an intrinsic morality. However, as we shall see, there are other psychological explanations which suggest our prosocial orientations are influenced more by environmental factors. In this slide, we see 4 pictures of the campus. One in the car park during the day, one in a quiet corridor of the Eden building, one in the main foyer of the Eden building, and the other one of the car park at night. In which of these situations would you feel most nervous about being approached by someone acting in a strange and unusual way? It's likely that most of you would have chosen A or D, and fewest perhaps would have chosen C, because of the belief that the fewer people around, the more danger you are in. We tend to believe that the more people who see our problem, the more likely we are to be helped. But is it true? In this slide, we see 4 pictures of the campus. One in the car park during the day, one in a quiet corridor of the Eden building, one of the main foyer in the Eden building, and one in the car park at night. In which of these situations would you be most nervous about being approached by someone who was acting strangely or in an unusual way? It's likely that most of you would have chosen A or D, and fewest of you would choose C, because of the belief that the fewer people around, the more danger you are in. We tend to believe that the more people who see our problem, the more likely we are to be helped. But is this true? The murder case of Kitty Genovese was both a harrowing criminal case, which took place in New York in the 1960s, but it has also had a significant legacy as being pivotal in the field of social psychology, in raising important and troubling issues, which in particular has come to be known as the Bystander Effect. In this murder case, the widely reported details were as follows. The murder of this young woman who was returning to her home after work was witnessed by 38 people. The time period of the crime was quite protracted. The killer was initially disturbed by a noise as he was attacking the woman, and she was then able to run off in the direction of her apartment. But he then returned and murdered Kitty in the doorway just outside her flat. It was reported that no one called the police, and that at least one person admitted they had turned up their radio to block out the noise. This case, unsurprisingly, created a public outroar and led to critical questions being pursued by psychologists to try and explain this level of inaction by such a large group of people. The story around this case challenged the prevailing portrayal of group psychology up until this point, in which groups were commonly associated with high levels of action and a greater propensity to display aggression, for example. A case like this presented a very different portrayal of a group, as somehow inhibiting action and reducing the individual's capacity to act. This pivotal and tragic murder case is attributed with the formation of two new research fields within the discipline: the study of prosocial behaviour and of urban psychology, the impact of densely populated environments on human behaviour. The explanatory account of prosocial decision-making that was put forward by Darley and Latané a few years later provides a partial explanation for some of the aspects reported in the Kitty Genovese case. They describe a decision-making framework that characterises the way one might interpret an ambiguous situation and make a decision on whether to intervene. Firstly, does the person notice? Whilst it was reported that 38 people did notice that Kitty Genovese was facing difficulties, this would have been a fraction of the total number of people living in this densely populated suburb of New York City. Secondly, how does one interpret the situation? The extent to which the individual perceives the need to act may be influenced by the level of ambiguity. Local residents may also be influenced by the level of self-esteem they have, so the willingness to risk embarrassment in taking action. Another factor is how we perceive other people to be reacting. Therefore, we are making social comparisons in this aspect. Further factors come into play. Given that we may have noticed the incident and feel there may be some requirement for intervention, it is likely that we will give consideration to whether this falls within our area of responsibility, or whether there may be others with more clearly defined responsibilities in this area. Someone with a neighbourhood watch role, or a building supervisor role, for example, in the case of the Kitty Genovese incident. Also, a factor may be the consideration of whether you feel you have the appropriate skills to intervene. If the person may require first aid, for example, or whether someone else in the vicinity is better skilled in this area. So, from the perspective of this model, there are several points at which an individual may discount themselves from the decision to intervene, and that likelihood may be increased when one is in the presence of a larger group. When we look at the fuller case analysis of the Kitty Genovese murder, we can see that there were multiple points of ambiguity that can partly explain this so-called bystander effect. Firstly, there were several calls to the police made that night, suggesting that several people had noticed and had interpreted the incident as requiring intervention. So this detail differed from the initial press reporting. Secondly, none of the witnesses had observed the attack in its entirety. As the case was explained, the first part of the incident took place near the location of Kitty's car, and the second part of the crime was committed just outside her flat door. So an ambiguity was therefore influencing, perhaps, the sense of the severity of the incident from the point of view of some of these observers. Most people heard only portions of the incident without realizing its full seriousness. Finally, no witnesses directly saw the final attack. So again, a sense that the so-called bystanders of this crime were witnessing a very partial view of the full incident. The Darley and Latané decision path model still leaves open the possibility that two individuals may give considerations to each of these factors up until the point of deciding whether to intervene, and yet may still differ in their final decision on whether or not to act. That is, whilst environmental factors may play a significant part in influencing one's propensity to act prosocially, there has been ongoing research into individual differences that can also exert influence. Let's now touch on a few of these. Firstly, locus of control, something we talked about in level I. The extent to which we feel a sense of agency and ability to control the situations we find ourselves in can vary across individuals, such that we might anticipate someone with a strong internal locus of control may be more inclined to act and act prosocially. Secondly, our beliefs and rationalizations about the social world can be influential. So-called beliefs in a just world. If we believe that we all have equal chances of success and failure in life, then we may be less inclined to assist, perceiving that the individual is somehow responsible for whatever misfortune has befallen them. However, if we believe that the world is not entirely equitous and fair, and that structural, sociological factors can perpetuate inequality, then we may be less inclined to attribute someone's misfortune to their own actions, and therefore may be more inclined to assist them. Thirdly, our perceptions of the social group and whether we perceive and attribute leadership can be a factor in whether we decide to intervene. A study by Baumeister showed this. In the experimental study, a leadership role was assigned randomly in a distractor task, following which a staged incident took place just outside the experimental room. It was found that 80% of those individuals who had just been assigned a leadership role went out to help, and only 35% of other group members did. Here we can see a range of other individual variables that have been a focus of study in this research field. In a study by Amato, the size of hometown was identified as a factor. That is, people who grew up in a smaller hometown showed a greater prosocial propensity. It is likely that they may have witnessed more prosocial activities in the smaller community setting in which they grew up. A study by Latané and Debs found that men are more likely to assist, and we can see how this outcome might be anticipated due to factors associated with gender roles and varying perceptions of risk associated with physical size and strength. A study by West and Brown suggested that physical looks and attractiveness can be a factor in whether help was offered to women, reflecting the subjective and subconscious ways in which such decisions can be made. Quite a number of studies dwell on the subjectivity of our decisions and how we can be primed and influenced by unrelated environmental factors, such as the presence of good or bad weather, or whether our mood has been induced in positive or negative ways by immediately prior events. Let's look at an example now to give an illustration of how these environmental and individual factors can interact. Look at this picture and just ask yourself very quickly what you would be inclined to do in this situation. Clearly, it may depend upon how we are interpreting the situation. So we can see someone is collapsed at the side of a road, and the situation we're seeing may seem ambiguous until we look a little more closely. So when first looking at this picture, we see what looks like a pool of blood next to the person's head. And we may be very inclined to want to take some action. The type of action we choose to take may be dependent on our sense of self-efficacy, our self-esteem, the extent to which we feel we might have any relevant skills in first aid, and if not, we may be inclined to make a phone call for the emergency services. But if we now advance the slide and look at it slightly more closely, and we can see that in fact beside this person's head is not the pool of blood we first thought, but an empty bottle of beer. This piece of information may, for some of us, significantly change our perception of the situation and our decisions about what actions to take. We might be inclined, or more inclined, for example, to think this person has just had a big night out and has, fallen into a drunken stupor and is best left to sleep it off. But as we can see, the situation with its ambiguities is one that our decisions on whether or not to act prosocially will be very much dependent upon our interpretation of the situation, the attributions they make, both of the image we see in front of us and the attributions we may make of this individual, but also of our own abilities and how equipped we feel we may be to take appropriate action. So as we shall see in the next set of slides in this part of the lecture, there have been two major accounts of the origin and nature of prosocial behaviour of humans which stand in contrast. One is biological and is derived largely from evolutionary theory. The other is social, and most social psychologists reject too heavy an emphasis on biological factors. We will look now at each of these classic explanatory accounts in turn. In this first account, an evolutionary explanation proposes that our propensity for prosocial action is associated with our genetic similarity to one another. However, this account has limited explanatory power. It might explain why we see people being willing to donate a kidney to a member of their extended family, such as in this case where the act is life-saving and some level of kinship exists. But this type of explanation cannot easily account for other forms of prosocial behaviour, such as continuing to support a failing football team, for example. Social exchange theory suggests that we take a cost-benefit perspective in making decisions about prosocial behaviour. We will first calculate what it will cost us and what benefits we will get in return. This formulation is represented as an individual transactional arrangement. But this perspective can also accommodate a group-based level of analysis, where our propensity to engage prosocially will be related to whether it brings benefits or not to our social group. In both of these aspects, the underpinning rationale is transactional. That is, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. An alternative to this social exchange view of prosocial behaviour is presented through an empathy altruism model. From this perspective, it is proposed that we have a genuinely compassionate desire to help, and this can be further fostered environmentally through socialising high empathy as a means of fostering a high level of group cohesiveness. A key component of empathy, therefore, is perspective taking and the ability to see from one another's perspective, suggesting that there is a key role for educators here. However, from this conceptualization, we would only define actions as empathic if they persisted after the initial events that provoked the prosocial response. A slightly different explanation is reflected from the egoistic model, somewhat more underpinned by a biological explanation. From this perspective, not helping leads to negative emotions. Therefore, we help in an attempt to eliminate our negative emotions. This implies the action is first prompted by a sense of emotional arousal, for which we are searching for explanations and means by which we can reduce the negative emotion we are experiencing. Here, we would be inclined to view prosocial actions as ego-driven responses. And perhaps in these terms, we would expect to see less consistency in prosocial behaviour. And we would not be surprised to see a level of moral hypocrisy. That is, we are perhaps more likely to act in a moral way when we benefit, and when it costs us, we are less likely to act in a moral way if we can get away with it. So, in broad summary, prosocial behaviour, in its many forms, is difficult to explain using these traditional, classic psychological explanations. Biological mechanisms can dispose you to act, but if, when, and how you act will depend on your history and immediate circumstances. However, in each of these accounts, the level of analysis is such that the individual is given the prime focus. Classic accounts of the origins of prosocial behaviour, that is, biological, evolutionary theory, and social learning theory, underplay the influence of the social group and group norms in influencing prosocial behaviour. And we see more recent theorising taking a more integrative approach and focusing upon methods of engaging prosocial behaviour through the reframing of social norms. A contributory strand of theory to this more integrative perspective, bringing into focus both the individual and the group, is supported by social identity theory. The so-called minimal group studies conducted by Henri Tajfel showed us that in very limited, superficial conditions, we can be induced to express group affiliations and to act prosocially in relation to other group members. The important issue arising from this body of work is to show us that these group identities can be permeable and malleable and not genetically determined by kinship relations, for example. A sustained body of experimental work following on the tradition of Henri Tajfel demonstrate how group allegiances and prosocial orientations can be activated by framing and reframing salience of the multiple group identities that we hold. Levine and colleagues demonstrate this phenomenon in a study where they activate the identities of male football supporters, firstly in terms of their football club affiliation, and secondly in terms of their national football team affiliation, and found that this would significantly influence the extent to which research participants in the experiment were inclined to offer help to a confederate in the experiment who was identified either as being a member of the same football club fan base or as a member of the larger fan base of supporting the England football team. The importance of group-based processes such as social categorization have been found to be important factors in our expressed willingness to engage in prosocial activity. We'll return to this in more depth in part 2 of the lecture, but we'll briefly outline here the research undertaken by Tom Crompton and colleagues on behalf of the Common Cause Foundation, which is a social enterprise working with government and community groups to enhance civic engagement and volunteering. Their research has shown that a significant inhibitor in people's willingness to act prosocially is the perception that other members of the public are less prosocial in their orientation, as you can see in the graph here. As you can see, the disparity in perception of self-civic-mindedness and the perceived civic-mindedness of an average citizen is particularly pronounced among women. This line of research is leading to an interest in practical approaches to facilitating prosocial behaviour by using particular ways of framing social issues and drawing out group identities which emphasize similarities rather than differences among members of the community. A range of experimental studies, such as the one cited by Mao here, illustrate that our prosocial orientations are very amenable to priming. We will explore these approaches more fully in part 2 of the lecture and give particular attention to the types of value orientations which we see being primed through the campaigns of charity organisations and the impact these have upon the prosocial behaviour of the members of public addressed by these campaigns. In summary then, we can see that there is a wide range of evidence that challenges the notion that being prosocial is a matter of how nice or moral we are, but rather is associated to a large extent with what is going on around us when the chance to be helpful arises. The attributions we make about the social world, such as how fair we think it is, and transient factors that can shape our mood and emotion can influence our prosocial behaviour as much as our personality or morals. And as we shall look at in part 2, there is a growing interest in the role of education and civic organisations in work that we can do to conceptually reframe social issues in ways that can invoke particular values and framings of issues that engage prosocial and collective activity. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in part 2.